All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to our Road to Recovery virtual engagement session focused on bird conservation on U.S. private lands. We're thrilled to have you join us today. We have a wonderful lineup of experts to dive into this very complex but critically important topic for bird conservation. So thanks for making time to join us today. We're planning on our session lasting 90 minutes. So we have a suite of presentations for you with some overview information. And then we will have time for discussion and conversation for the last part of the session. Since we do have a relatively large group, feel free to utilize the chat feature, and I will do my best, as well as the rest of our presentation team, to monitor questions there. I'll also be saving that chat, and my intent is to follow up this session with some resources and tips for moving forward in your own work, focusing on private lands conservation for birds, and I'll do my best to address any questions in that follow-up content that we're not able to get to today. So thanks again for joining us. My name is Katie Holland. I am a research scientist at Virginia Tech, where I serve as a National Bird Conservation Social Science Coordinator. And in that role, I'm fortunate to have the opportunity to work with Road to Recovery as a staff social scientist. So I recognize many of the names here in our audience. I have the privilege to connect with many of you before, but if we haven't connected yet, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here, and thanks for engaging with us on this important topic. So our goal today is to build off of critical conversations that we started at the Road to Recovery workshop in January. Some of you may have had the opportunity to join us there at NCTC in January for our in-person workshop, but if not, we're very glad to have you here and to continue this work and these conversations together. We're focused on breaking private lands conservation as much as possible into actionable steps. And if you've interacted with me through my role as Road to Recovery social scientist at all, you know that I try to make it clear that when we're talking about private lands engagement, when we're talking about work with people for birds, we're not asking every biologist to become a social scientist. We're not asking you to necessarily take up all of the responsibility for this type of outreach and engagement work. But what we want to do is break this type of work and these efforts into actionable steps for species working groups and for bird recovery. And so that's where we'll focus today, on what are those actionable steps for species working groups. How can we move forward in this work together, supporting people, supporting landowners, and working towards recovery of tipping point bird populations. So for today, we will be focusing on private lands conservation within the US. We want to recognize that private land ownership across our country and across the world is a very complex topic that often includes the history of a lot of challenge, a lot of injustice. The way that we define land ownership varies drastically depending on our group membership and the types of lands where we're working, living, and trying to conserve the environment. We do plan with Road to Recovery to focus on what private lands conservation means outside US borders, different forms of land ownership and stewardship, and how those words mean different things to different groups. So we acknowledge that very complex history that falls within this topic. Our focus today is on private lands within the US, and specifically those that are owned by individuals and private land owners. We're going to look at the US Farm Bill and some of the legislation that's relevant to private lands conservation in the US, and also hear from some landowners and takeaways from landowner workshops and listening sessions that have taken place across the country. So with that in mind, I'll introduce today's experts who will be leading our conversation. I'll introduce them each individually as we move forward with our session today, but we're very grateful to have them here. Thank you to all of you for sharing your time and your expertise with us. So without further ado, I will introduce our first contributor. Kelly retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service after a 34-year career and served as a private lands coordinator for the state of Missouri administering the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, working with landowners, and building partnerships with others to restore and enhance wetlands, uplands, and various other habitats for endangered species. She also led and was a member of the steering committee for the Missouri Bird Conservation Initiative, which is a partnership to protect Missouri birds and their habitats. She currently works as the Lesser Yellowlegs International Working Group Coordinator with a focus on full annual cycle bird conservation. Through my role with Road to Recovery, I've had the privilege of working with Kelly on a number of different projects, and I'm very grateful to have her expertise here as well. So Kelly's going to give us an overview. Kelly was instrumental in incorporating this topic into our work in January at the Road to Recovery workshop. And she'll begin by giving us a recap of the conversations that were had there and how we're going to build off of those today. Kelly, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate that. And yes, we have had an opportunity to work together and find the best ways to move forward to provide for bird conservation across the spectrum. I'm happy that we have so many participants in this talk today. We definitely had a very good outcome when we had our January workshop, and there may be some people joining us today who were in that workshop, but I'm so very happy that we also have some new folks at the table who had other interests that they wanted to attend at the workshop in January. And now they're taking some time out of their day to actually talk about this very important topic, engaging private landowners in conservation for birds. I just want to go over real quickly, and I'm not going to get too far in the weeds here, just to kind of tell you what we were trying to do at the January workshop, and that was basically bridging the gap between landowners and conservation efforts, whether that be research or habitat needs for birds. And we wanted to have folks here from landowners as well as professionals, and definitely conservation delivery personnel who actually do conservation work on the ground. We wanted to find ways to work jointly between social science and landowners, and building trust, which is one of the key things to do. As Katie said, we are focused in the United States, and when it comes to bird conservation in the United States, about 70% of the country is privately owned. So there's absolutely no way we can accomplish our goals for bird conservation without involving private landowners. And in order to do that, we need to have joint problem solving. And we got together in January to kind of open that conversation about ways that we needed to do that. We actually had Dave Walker join us and provide us with a summary of all the different conservation programs that are offered. And he's with us again today to go over that as well. And there is a plethora of alphabet soup when it comes to private land conservation programs that are available to private landowners. But what we really want to do is find ways to help you understand ways to engage those private land programs with other partners and pool resources in order to really achieve good quality habitat work on the ground for your bird, if that happens to be what one of the issues is with the bird that you're trying to conserve. All of the things that we'll talk about today as far as private land programs is voluntary partnerships. So if we're going to talk about voluntary partnership, we have to earn trust of landowners, and we have to know ways to engage people so that they understand what we're trying to achieve. And we also have to consider what their needs are too. And so we had a unique opportunity in January where Partnerscapes joined us, which is a private landowner forum. It's a group of private landowners who work to drive conservation and the continuing sustainability of a working farm and conservation efforts. And so we had Steve Jester with us, and some of the board members of Partnerscapes join us. And today we have Steve Jester again, as well as Heather Johnson, who will be helping us with some of the conversations related to listening forums. So I'm not going to go any further than that. I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood kind of where we started in January and how we want to keep this conversation moving forward. We likely will have additional workshops down the road. This isn't the only one, so please stay tuned to that. And probably one of the biggest things that people do need to understand, and Katie explained this well, don't necessarily think that you're the one that has to be the person that goes out and visits with private landowners. Building a partnership of people with diverse skills and backgrounds is the best way to achieve bird conservation, I have found. So without further ado, I'll pass it back to Katie and she'll introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Kelly. And as I mentioned, Kelly has really been instrumental in helping and supporting Road to Recovery and engaging in this important topic. So Kelly, a million thanks, and thanks for being here with us today to share your expertise. So I'll stop sharing here. I'm going to introduce our first presenters, Dave Walker and Andrew Schmidt. Dave, as I introduce you, if you want to get your screen up and going, that would be awesome. So I'll start with Dave. Dave Walker has served as the Farm Conservation Programs Coordinator in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Headquarters Office for the past 18 years. Dave works at the national level with the U.S. Department of Agriculture agencies responsible for implementing the conservation programs of the Farm Bill to maximize fish and wildlife benefits of those programs. Prior to his position with the service, Dave worked for 4 years as the Farm Bill Coordinator for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And before moving to the East Coast, Dave spent 17 years with the Arizona Game and Fish Department, working in several positions, starting as a district wildlife manager and progressing to chief of the Habitat branch. Dave received his bachelor's degree in wildlife science from from University of Michigan and a master's degree in wildlife science from New Mexico State University. Dave currently lives in Northern Virginia with his wife and 2 sons. Dave will be presenting today with Andrew Schmidt. Andrew is the Director of Government Affairs for Pheasants Forever and Quails Forever. There, he leads the organization's federal advocacy efforts, including reauthorization and implementation of the Farm Bill. No stranger to the wildlife and bird conservation community, Andrew previously worked for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and for Ducks Unlimited, where he worked on the 2014 and 2018 Farm Bills, advocating for programs and policies that benefit both people and wildlife. Dave and Andrew are both experts in this field. We're grateful for their time. They're going to provide us with an overview of Farm Bill programs and how we as bird conservation advocates and professionals can engage in this work. So Dave and Andrew, thanks so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Dave, you might be on mute if you're kicking things off.
There we go.
Perfect.
Better?
Yep.
Got it.
It's been a long day already. I appreciate very much the invitation. Thank you, Katie. It's great to be here. Talking about the Farm Bill. I always enjoy talking about the Farm Bill, and I know Andrew enjoys it as well. So we wanted to do a kind of a tag team presentation to you today, give you just a little bit of a background, a quick overview of the Farm Bill, what it is and why it's so important. I look at it as an essential tool for bird conservation on private lands. And then talk a little bit about how the resources coming through the Farm Bill conservation programs are targeted toward priority wildlife resources, including birds, and then give you some information about how the bird conservation community can influence how those programs are being implemented, how they can influence decisions by USDA, NRCS, and the Farm Service Agency about how these programs are put on the ground for the benefit of the birds. So that's going to be our approach. I think we'll just roll right into this. Can folks see the slides? Do I need to do the, can try the beginning? Does that work better?
Yeah, Dave, real quick, can you hit display settings? There might be an option to switch the we're seeing your presenter mode. Yep.
Oh,
That second one should have an option to swap up top.
all right. Sorry about that. All right. So we'll just run through this. The big question, well, what is the Farm Bill? It's really the comprehensive policy tool for the federal government related to agriculture. And it's a huge piece of legislation. It's got 12 titles, but it addresses all types of agricultural policy issues from food production, fiber production, commodity programs, nutrition assistance, which is a big piece of the whole Farm Bill funding pie. That's what we used to know as food stamps. It's now a SNAP program. Talks about energy, rural development, but a couple of the important titles, at least important for this discussion, is conservation and forestry. Initiated in 1933 in response to the Dust Bowl situation, that we've got to get a handle on agriculture production and policies related to that. The first conservation provisions came about in the Food Security Act of 1985, and that Farm Bill is supposed to be reauthorized every 5 years. We're not quite on track with that with this 2018 Farm Bill. And a lot of times we aren't on the 5-year schedule. But we'll talk a little bit about that later. But again, the question of why focusing on the Farm Bill, Kelly mentioned this earlier, 70% of the land base is in private ownership, private stewardship. And a lot of this is crop, pasture, and rangeland that we have opportunities to put conservation on the ground with the help of our landowner partners. 2/3 of listed species use habitat on private lands, and obviously, this has already been discussed, private land is critical to sustaining bird populations. And another reason, the real big reason we're paying attention to the Farm Bill is the money. The current Farm Bill, which was signed into law in December of 2018, provides over $5 billion annually in each of the 5 years of its authorization for these voluntary incentive-based conservation programs. And the Inflation Reduction Act came along in 2022 and puts on top of that annual authorization money spread out over 4 years to the tune of $19.5 billion. So that IRA funding was a huge infusion of dollars for the conservation program. But I'll let Andrew jump in here and give you kind of a scale idea of what we're talking about.
Thanks, Dave. And I want to clarify for everyone, I mean no ill will whatsoever to many of these wonderful programs that have very small bars on this chart, but it's helpful, I think, to get some kind of visualization of just truly how big the Farm Bill conservation title is, and why it matters so much, and why I think to ignore it would be detrimental to a lot of the work that the wildlife and bird community is doing. So I always like to include this kind of chart, and this chart got even more impactful after the IRA bumped up that last bar quite a bit. The other thing that's somewhat unique to Farm Bill programs in the conservation title is that they receive what's called mandatory funding, which means that they receive their funding from the Farm Bill itself and not annual appropriations. And that really sets these programs apart from great programs like NACA or Partners for Fish and Wildlife and others that have to receive money from Congress each year during appropriations. The Farm Bill programs have a little more consistency and continuity as far as the amount of money they bring to conservation. You can go to the next as my dog sees somebody. You know, one thing about Farm Bill policy wonks is that we put these in is that we often are accused of lacking. Can y'all still hear me? Okay. One thing about Farm Bill policy wonks is that we're often accused of lacking self-awareness. So this alphabet soup is a little bit of a way to show that we do understand how we talk about programs and the acronym soup that we give you all. But for me, this is a little bit similar to if I saw a long list of scientific bird names that I wouldn't know what they meant. So I do want to talk about a few of these programs, though, real quick to give you a little bit of an idea of the scope of Farm Bill conservation. So if you want to go to the next slide, Dave. So I'll start with the Conservation Reserve Program, which is the longest running and, at least for some of the wildlife community, perhaps the most well-known conservation program in the Farm Bill. CRP provides annual rental payments and cost share to establish conservation cover on marginal, highly erodible, environmentally sensitive cropland and pasture land. It can get fairly complex, as seeing a couple of the names come on the call, as many of you know, with different signups and initiatives. But one that I'll highlight, I think Dave's going to touch on a little bit later, is the State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement, or SAFE initiative, which is a partnership with state agencies and partners to tailor CRP practices at the state level to meet habitat needs for species of ecological and economic concern. The Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, provides cost share and financial assistance for conservation practices on land in or associated with active agricultural production. It's the largest program administered by NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and also has a statutory requirement for at least 10% of all funding to be targeted at wildlife conservation practices. So it's especially important when we talk about conserving and enhancing bird habitat. And as we show here, that was almost or a little over 375 million this year when you add up all the 10% of all that funding. It's also the program that's utilized as part of Working Lands for Wildlife, which again we'll speak to a little bit later. So EQIP participants are able to use that funding for targeted initiatives towards again species of conservation need and at risk. EQIP participants address resource concerns on all or a portion of their operation through one or more contracts, which is a little bit different than the Conservation Stewardship Program, which targets enrollment of a producer's entire operation with annual payments to adopt new conservation practices or continue existing conservation efforts to kind of increase that conservation baseline each year. Folks are likely familiar, or many folks are going to be familiar with what used to be known as the Wetland Reserve Program. So that's now part of ACEP, the Ag Conservation Easement Program, which has two types of easement sub-programs. One is wetland reserve easements, which protects and restores and enhances wetlands and associated habitats on marginal and poor crop ground, and usually converted wetlands. And then on the other side is the what are called the agricultural land easements, which limit non-ag uses on farm and grasslands through eligible entities and land trusts, and where we see a lot of what are called grasslands of special significance easements. And this has become really effective, especially in Wyoming and Montana and Idaho with sage-grouse habitat, as well as throughout the Great Plains with grassland easements. Then finally, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP, allows USDA to enter into agreements with state, local, and NGO partners to leverage non-USDA funding to deliver partner-led projects in specific geographic areas to meet specific natural resource concerns. And again, I'm sure many on the call are involved in past or current RCPP projects. So they can tell you, as I will, that it is a complex program, but one with tremendous potential for bird and habitat conservation at the landscape and regional scale to really target in and leverage non-federal dollars towards priority species and priority landscapes. So I told you I found a little bit of self-awareness with alphabet soup, but then I gave you a bit of a deep dive into a few of those programs. But I'll kick it back to Dave to pull me out of this rabbit hole.
Thanks, Andrew. And we tend to dive right into the alphabet soup. So if we're saying something and you're thinking, what is that? What program? What are you talking about? Just let us know. So this just quickly to go over the basic elements of all of the conservation programs. As was mentioned earlier, they're all voluntary. It's working with the landowners and making sure that we're doing things that can help them meet their land management and conservation objectives, while also working toward our objectives as well. So it has to work out for the landowner. All of the programs describe conservation of soil, water, and fish and wildlife habitat as either a program purpose or a program benefit. So all of these programs can help support bird conservation efforts. So we can work with all these programs to do good things on the ground for bird conservation. The programs provide technical assistance and financial assistance. So all of the program money comes in these, essentially comes in these two buckets, where the financial assistance is made available, as well as technical assistance to the landowners who implement those practices. And most of the programs are competitive with some sort of ranking criteria or prioritization process. There's more demand for these programs than there is money. So there needs to be a way to figure out how to put the resources where they're going to do the most good. As I mentioned, delivery to landowners is through financial assistance, which comes in a lot of different forms. There's practice payments, incentive payments, rental payments annually. There are easement payments, so all types of different forms of financial assistance. And then the technical assistance comes from a wide array of folks from the NRCS staff, what we call TSPs or non-NRCS assistance from partners that are helping NRCS provide this technical assistance, interagency and cooperative agreements, where Fish and Wildlife Service, the Pheasant Forever, the NGOs, we're working through agreements with NRCS to provide this technical assistance. And this assistance can also include monitoring of effects analysis. So again, on the ground delivery, it requires really effective outreach, targeting landowners where the conservation on the ground is going to do the most good, and having the right people in the right places to contact landowners and deliver this conservation on the ground. And it reflects the importance of the partnerships. We've got a lot of boots on the ground from all different groups, from different agencies, helping these landowners put conservation. As was mentioned, there's ways of targeting a lot of these conservation programs. We've got CRP, which is the largest conservation program, nearly 25 million acres now signed up. And we've got different pieces of CRP that are targeted in different ways. But the general CRP has something called the Environmental Benefits Index, where landowners that are making offers to enroll in CRP are competing nationwide to get into the program, and there's a scoring mechanism to score their offers and decide whether they're going to be accepted into the program. There's continuous CRP, which simply means that offers are being accepted year-round. General CRP usually has a very limited sign-up period. Continuous CRP applies year-round and is open to anyone that meets the basic criteria for getting into enrolling in CRP. There's a lot of opportunities in continuous CRP through specific practices that are targeted toward bird conservation. We've got duck nesting habitat, and this is just the number of acres that are currently enrolled in those particular practices. Non-floodplain playa wetlands, upland bird habitat buffers. A lot of people call that the quail buffers. Pollinator habitat, and then state acres for wildlife enhancement. That's, you know, it's SAFE, which is state-based continuous CRP that's developed with partners, state fish and wildlife agencies to address particular wildlife resources. Got quite a few acres on board. And then there's the grassland CRP, which is basically looking at conserving existing grassland, preventing their conversion, and supporting grazing activities on those grasslands. So those are the different types of CRP and how they're targeted. NRCS has a lot of initiatives that are targeting wildlife priorities. And we've got something called the Working Lands for Wildlife Model of Conservation, which looks at conserving at-risk species while supporting farming, ranching, and forestry operations. And right now, there are 7 national species habitats that are included in Working Lands for Wildlife, and 15 state identified Working Lands for Wildlife projects. So we have a map coming up that shows you kind of where those are. And NRCS is also coming out with these large landscape conservation frameworks. They're calling frameworks for conservation action. We've got 3 of those in place already for one for the sagebrush biome, one for Great Plains grasslands, and one for northern bobwhite grasslands and savannas, where they're looking at the specific threats to those habitats and focusing their efforts to address those threats in areas where it's going to make the most difference for these priority species. And they're also developing 4 new conservation frameworks: Eastern Aquatic Connectivity, Eastern Deciduous Forest, Southeastern Pine Ecosystems, and Western Migratory Big Game. It's well on its way to just expanded their effort out west. I think a key for these efforts is they may be focused or identified for a particular species like sage grouse, but they're also benefiting multiple species. Wherever these efforts are ongoing, we've got a lot of species that are benefiting from the approach is taken. So this is just a map showing you where these areas are. And really covering a lot of the country. So they're doing a good job of figuring out how they can target these enormous resources for these specific species. So I'll turn it back over to Andrew and talk a little bit about how this money can be spent and hopefully directed to our fish and wildlife and bird conservation priority. Because I guarantee you they're going to spend every dollar. The goal is to obligate all the money that Congress has provided. I'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, so as we talked, there's a lot of money in these programs, and there are a lot of programs in a lot of states and a lot of different types of cropland and grassland and rangeland, forest land and wetlands. So the big question continues to be the biggest challenge is having an impact on USDA's decision making and policy development to steer as many of those programs towards wildlife benefits as possible. One thing that happens in the Farm Bill space is that tons of groups are intensely engaged throughout the Farm Bill reauthorization process with Congress. And then once they finally pass a Farm Bill, whenever that happens, many of them disappear until the next one comes around 5 years later. And what a lot of these groups sometimes miss is that passing a bill is only the first step in the process. And what comes after that is a multi-year, multi-step process of USDA promulgating rulemaking, updating program policies and guidance to implement the changes that Congress made. The Farm Bill might be about 1,000 pages long, but it doesn't cover everything. For instance, 10% of EQIP has to go to wildlife practices. But what are those practices? How should they be implemented? Does implementing one practice in one state and ecosystem look the same as the same practice 2 time zones away? These are the kind of questions that are addressed and affected during rulemaking and agency policy updates. So it's vital that conservation stakeholders stay engaged throughout the process to inform those decisions. There's also a tremendous opportunity to get involved at the state and local level. State technical committees, local working groups, these bodies and entities drive a lot of the funding and implementation decisions of NRCS and USDA programs. One thing about NRCS is that they're probably the most, I'll say, federalist of federal agencies. What I mean by that is that decisions are made proudly at the state level based off of local and state priorities. I can list off several examples over the last decade where USDA made a decision about a program or initiative at the national level, and the state offices did not respond with enthusiasm. So if you want to influence program implementation and funding decisions, the best place to get involved is at the state technical committee, local working groups with conservation districts and partners to really inform what these programs do and the impact they can have on habitat and bird populations and wildlife in general. Finally, there's an increase. There continues to be an increased emphasis on monitoring and evaluation of outcomes following practice and program implementation. So, 2 things that I'll mention. I know they're going to be linked in the presentation as well. But the Farm Service Agency, which implements CRP, works with partners to identify monitoring, assessment, and evaluation projects to quantify CRP outcomes and environmental benefits to water quality and quantity, wildlife, the rural economy, climate, and they publish all of these and link to them on the website. And there's tons of really great projects and studies ongoing and that have been completed that I'm sure many folks on this call and involved with Road to Recovery have been authors of or worked on over the last several years. And then CEAP, or the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, is a multi-agency effort led by NRCS to measure the effects of Farm Bill programs and practices, and then using those results to improve conservation planning, on the ground program management, policy decisions. Primarily focuses on 4 national assessments: cropland, wildlife, wetlands, and grazing lands. And the wildlife component of SEEP has really been just hugely instrumental in the success of working lands for wildlife, and building out some of those frameworks that Dave mentioned, and setting up for success in the future with those partnerships and initiatives. So really, when it comes to implementation and monitoring and evaluation, those are two things that we really wanted to hone in on today with this group, making sure folks know where we can really have an impact in both the implementation and measuring outcomes and finding out what these farm programs are doing. It's $8 billion in a year, and we all kind of have a fair idea of like, okay, we think it's doing this, but it's a lot of dollars and a lot of acres and a lot of contracts out there. So being able to measure and assess the results is going to be huge if we want to keep steering that money towards these programs and these practices. So Dave has a couple of these links here, and I'd imagine we'll send this around, or this will be sent around to those that want to check out some of these studies and some of these program materials. But you have our emails and phone number there, so please don't hesitate to reach out. And I know we're going to have some time for question and discussion. So yeah, thank you, Dave. If I missed anything, chime in. Otherwise, we can send it back to Katie.
Thank you both. Incredibly informative, so much information there. And I know that was just the tip of the iceberg. So appreciate the breakdown and the focus on these actionable steps for bird conservation. We will take questions, but we're going to move to our other half of the presentations first, and then have a joint discussion Q&A session at the end, so that all of our presenters can chime in to questions and we can have a dialogue, because I think the expertise that we have in this group really complements each other, and we'll be able to get really great perspectives on your questions. So if you have questions in mind based on what Andrew and Dave just presented, feel free to put them in the chat now, and we can revisit when we get to the Q&A, or jot them down so that you have them handy when we revisit in a couple minutes. So we will move forward to our next portion of the presentation, and I'll introduce Steve Jester and Heather Johnson. Steve has been the Executive Director of Partnerscapes, which was formerly Partners for Conservation, since 2013. Steve has worked at the intersection of conservation and agriculture for over 30 years, and has held positions with state conservation agencies, conservation-focused nonprofit organizations, and in the private sector in a variety of roles that all involve engagement with private landowners and voluntary conservation through public-private partnerships. Steve currently lives in Central Texas, north of San Antonio. And Steve will be co-presenting with Heather Johnson. So Heather recently retired from 33 years with the Fish and Wildlife Service. She spent 10 years in Alaska working at the Togiak National Wildlife Refuge in Dillingham, and the rest in external affairs and migratory bird management in the regional office in Anchorage. She then worked in Washington, D.C. as a senior conservation biologist for the Division of International Conservation, and then at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Her last 18 years with the Fish and Wildlife Service were in the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program in the Mountain Prairie region, where she was the regional chief of that program. Heather now manages a small business, H Big Sage LLC, with her husband, who we all love and enjoy working with, especially through the Lesser Yellowlegs Working Group, Brad Andrus, and she currently works as a contractor as well for Partnerscapes. Steve and Heather, thank you both so much for joining us here, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you.
Great.
So much.
Thanks, Katie.
Do you want me to do the slides now, Steve?
Please, Heather. I'm gonna give just a few minutes here on the front end, and Heather's gonna do most of the presentation. But I'm really honored for to be able to spend some time with you and share a little bit about our organization, what we've been up to the last 18 months or so specifically. But Partnerscapes is a landowner-led organization that works on exclusively on the people and relationship side of conservation. I think we're the only group that I know of that's all that we work on. We don't do direct conservation delivery, although the directors, my board directors, are all private land stewards and private land managers of the first quality in their own right. The reason that they are a part of this organization is because they've discovered that the power of partnerships across perspectives is extremely important to their operations, to their local human communities, and to their landscapes, as far as remaining sustainable in very challenging times for a number of reasons. Next slide, Heather.
All right, there we go.
Yeah, so this is our mission statement and vision. It has a lot of commonality with other organizations that you may be familiar with that have sort of evolved to this over the last several years. But I think the key point to take away from this is our view of conservation is what we call the three legs of the stool approach. You can't look at ecology, economy, or the social aspects of landscape level conservation as single factors. Landowners typically make decisions, and in any entity that works on the landscape makes decisions at the intersection of some level of optimization of all those three sets of factors in almost all conditions. So under almost all conditions. So instead of being intimidated or concerned by that, we embrace it in everything that we do. We know that you cannot have conservation without people and human communities, and so that's why we feel it's so important to work on these relationship and partnership aspects, because all conservation policy and conservation funding may originate at the top of the chain, or at the state capital or at the national capital, but really conservation delivery is like all politics in the United States. It's local. It's done with people at the tip of the spear that live and work on the land for the most part, or partner with those people that live and work on the land for the most part. Next slide, Heather. So we have been doing a series of what we call partnership forums. We've done 3 so far, one in the West, one in the East, and one in the Midwestern states, upper Midwestern states, in response to a couple of factors. Voluntary conservation that we've talked about with the Farm Bill, in my opinion anyway, and I think it can be adequately demonstrated that it's actual subdiscipline of conservation with very little formalized training. You can go get a concentration in mammalogy, ornithology, research methods, whatever you want. You can get professionally trained in those particular aspects of conservation, but conservation delivery, particularly on private lands, is somewhat unique, and it requires a separate set of skills and knowledge, skills, and abilities that are not typically taught in a formalized educational process. So most people, like Heather and like myself, we come to this work, and a lot of the learning that we do, we either have picked up in our early development, or we've picked up from mentors or people that we've worked with within these organizations that are already doing this job. There's really, really, really formal training for this work. Right now, as Andrew and Dave mentioned, there is an abundance of resources for projects, primarily through the Farm Bill, but really, although not all funding pots have expanded, the expansion of funding pots goes back to the previous administration and full funding for Land and Water Conservation Fund and some other things that happen. So there's all these resources that are not only available to do work on private lands, but there's we're probably at near the a nadir in our capacity to deliver that funding, both in bodies, but also in knowledge, skills, and abilities of the people that are in those roles. So since we work on the people side of conservations and partnerships, we try to stay out front in supporting landowners, communities, and practitioners in delivering, developing the relationships needed to deliver all this funding that's available. That's what we feel like our strengths are, and that's what we feel like is most important. If the right people are at the table, typically the work will get done, particularly when the desire to do work together can be articulated in a fashion that multiple outputs from a particular landscape or a particular piece of ground are addressed in the vision for this conservation work. I always talk about try to find the overlap between what you want to do as a practitioner, what your goals are for your species or your ecological community that you're working on, and what it is about that particular species and its needs, or about that particular habitat type and its existence that's important for things other than just its intrinsic value to people that live on the land and people that are related to the land or own the land. So what we started these partnership forums as a path to learn more about what we could do specifically to help with our current challenges in delivering voluntary conservation, as well as get an idea of what landowners and practitioners that are engaged in this work feel like they need, which may not be something that we can do, but we can certainly shine a light on what the needs are, and maybe put together partnerships of our own to help address those, so we can raise all boats with the tide of this huge amount of funding for work on the land. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather to talk about what we did in these forums and what we learned, and look forward to being around for questions on the other side. So Heather, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Steve. And I've noticed a lot of friends that I haven't seen in a while on the call today. So it's great to see everybody, and nice to meet new people as well. So thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, this slide is just kind of a picture of the participants from the 3 forums. So we had about 85 people in the West out in Nevada, got about 85 people in one in the Midwest. We had a few less in the East because we had a huge snowstorm. You guys were out there, a lot of you, for the R2R meeting in NCTC at the same time. So you know the storm that came through, but we had really good participation in all 3 of those forums, and the makeup of those was, about a third private landowners to about a half private landowners, as well as practitioners and Partners for Fish and Wildlife biologists that are working on the ground. So it was fun to be able to have that mix of participants. We did about a day and a half to 2 days. The first one was a day and a half. We were a little bit short on time, so we expanded that to 2 days, and we split it into basically 3 big chunks. So we wanted to reach out to these participants and really get a feel for, first, what are the top skills, the keys to success to being a successful private lands biologist. So we wanted that input from all the participants, from the landowners, from people that are like boots on the ground, as well as a variety of practitioners. We also wanted to know what the gaps were out there. What are the gaps? What are the barriers to reaching our full potential for collaborative conservation? And then what are those strategies for filling those gaps, or eliminating, or at least reducing some of those barriers? And then we also just wanted to look at networking. What's happening out there in terms of networking with collaborative conservation, working with private landowners, and how can we accelerate that? How can we take those things that are working really well and do more of them across the regions and across the nation? And we did that by first doing panel discussions. So those panels were made up of private landowners, practitioners, private lands biologists, and we tried to bring those experts in on the panel, and then have a moderator leading a series of questions for the panelists. And then we opened it up to the whole room to ask kind of a Q&A session of those panelists. And that really helped to sort of set the stage for each of those major 3 categories that we were trying to look at throughout those forums. And then we did a series of facilitated activities. So we tried to look at learning styles. We tried to do small group activities, large group activities, mix people around so they're working with different people that maybe they didn't know, to get some different perspectives. And that seemed to work really well. We didn't have any PowerPoint presentation. We had no technology in the room. Everybody just kind of checked their phones at the door, so to speak. And we rolled up our sleeves. We had whiteboards on the wall and sticky walls and sticky notes in the middle of the table. And then we started to create the room. And we didn't have any like voting where you go and do a little sticky dot and then a voting and there's winners and losers. Basically, we wanted every single thought coming out of people's heads and minds and ideas and just capturing all of them. And people were able to go up to these walls and get them up there and then be able to do aha moments. Man, what you said was so awesome. Getting some quotes from different people in the room. And then we started to look at those clusters. And Jolene Littlejohn from out there in the Midwest, or up in the Pacific Northwest, she's an expert at this kind of facilitation style. So she helped us to be able to build those clusters and try to see what was really popping, what was rising above some of the other things at sort of the end of the day. And then networking was a huge part of it. You know, we had people gathering for breakfast, we had lunches, we had evening socials and storytelling. We had open space sessions and a lot of breaks so people could network with each other, and then invited everybody to think about the fact that we're not just going to have one session and leading to the next, we're closing that door and going, but we're going to create a thread between all of those. So there's always a go back. You know, you have something where it's like, oh my God, I didn't even think about that. But that to me is really important. Well, go get a sticky note up there. And so it was very interactive throughout the entire event. And then we took each of those sessions, and of course I pulled down all those sticky notes and all the flip charts, and so it's hundreds of things, and it just started to distill that down. And then we took at all of the results across the entire nation after that 3-workshop series and started to look at what was the absolute most important that was rising to the top at that national level. So here's kind of the results that we came up with. So for those top skills and keys to success to private lands, working with private landowners, trust. I think you heard that from Kelly, and you heard that from Katie. The trust is critically important. First, to establish that trust, and then to be able to maintain that trust in those partnerships. And of course, that comes with a tremendous amount of time. Sometimes the slower you go, the faster you get there. You have to really think about honesty and integrity. The second one leading like right behind that, of course, was listen. You're not going to build trust if you're not stopping to really listen, to hear people, really thinking about listening to hear and understand, being patient, being curious, asking a lot of questions. So that popped up as really critically important. And then just finding that common ground. Don't come with the things that separate us, but think about those things that bring us together. There's a lot more that brings us together than separates us when we look at private lands and conservation and what's happening out there in the landscape. So let's find that common ground. And then I really think about two-way communication. So not talking at people, but talking with people, finding out what really resonates with them, what their needs are, and then finding a way to be able to make those things work for the private landowner. We also found that being a part of community came up as really big across the whole nation. If you can live and work in the communities that are the heart of your focus area, you're going to be more successful. Don't just show up at the ranch or the farm, with an agenda like, well, my species is yellowlegs, and what you have here, I need to do this, this, and this on your place to be able to make a difference. It's like, well, maybe start with going down, having a cup of coffee, having a beer with somebody, meet at the local gathering place, go to a picnic, participate in a branding, like really get engaged in the community. And that can make a really big difference in terms of creating those relationships, building that trust, and then eventually those friendships, and really be able to get a lot of things done on the ground. Flexibility came up is really, really big. That we can't just make assumptions about people. Everyone is really different. Like farmers think this way, ranchers do this. Well, no, there needs to be a lot of flexibility in terms of what those needs are for those individual families on their operations. And then when we have programs that can be able to be more flexible and allow that, it tends to work really well for private landowners. And then just being a knowledgeable resource, that's really important, you know, show up, know your stuff, but don't overstretch, you know what you know and be honest about what you don't know, and then continue to learn. You come from that background in wildlife biology, then learn the agricultural side. If you come from agriculture, learn that wildlife side and really be able to say, hey, you know, I really don't know, but it's something I want to learn more. And so being that knowledgeable resource is critically important. Some of the gaps and barriers that really rose to the top are, first of all, funding. We talk about that, you know, being a gap. You know, we continue to need funding to support these conservation practices and programs, as well as the capacity. Sometimes we have the money to be able to do the projects, but we actually don't have enough bodies, boots on the ground, to be able to deliver that funding. And then staff turnover is big. You know, we've got some of these folks who've been there for the very beginning with like Partners for Fish and Wildlife, you know, celebrating, you know, 35 years. Well, now they're retiring and we have turnover, and sometimes they're not backfilling behind people. They're not overlapping with those experts. And so that turnover can be a real gap or a barrier. Training. Sometimes people are coming in and there's not the right people to be able to be there to give them the training that they need. So it's slowing things down. It's taking people much, you know, too long to be able to get up to speed. Communication was a gap. You know, sometimes we're talking through each other. We're competing with each other instead of working together. You know, sometimes, you know, we're duplicating efforts or there's a gap. So communication was big. Sometimes we have leadership not recognizing what's happening on the ground, and therefore policies being created that is actually not working for the landowner, not working for the people on the ground. So communication came up as big, as well as diversity, you know, not just ethnic and racial diversity, that's big, of course, but also just that diversity of expertise and experience. Then some of the stuff that came up, you know, big strategies and opportunities, was just increasing and diversifying those funding opportunities. You know, we find that sometimes it's too rigid in terms of what we can do. So, right, really increasing it, but then diversifying those opportunities. We talked about increasing that capacity and reducing that turnover of staff. Sometimes having the ability to put people right in the heart of their focus area where they can be more effective, they stay longer. Sometimes it's a matter of hiring officials, hiring for the right types of skills, really asking the right questions, and making sure that we hire the right people in those right places. As well as we talked about increasing our training and also our mentoring, you know, making sure that, you know, when people are coming in, we're having that transferability of those good ideas as well as those skills on the ground. And just that increase of outreach and communication, we talk about that so much. We can't just do the great things. We have to tell our story more. So that's really critically important. With networking, mentoring came up as something that in our networking, we can do a lot more mentoring, maybe landowner to landowner. So the landowner to landowner, peer-to-peer exchanges, that came up as being really big, as well as just those local events, you know, that if you're doing something really neat out on your operation, being willing to say, hey, you know, I'm going to have a little luncheon, some snacks, come on out and see what I'm doing. And sometimes, you know, we can have that sharing of ideas, you know, those workshops, field trips to really be able to, like we said, have that transferability of those good ideas and getting more of the good stuff going on the ground and sharing, really being able to share versus competing. And then outreach, you know, there's a lot of great social media out there, helping people to get connected on some of those sites, being willing to share if there's folks, landowners perhaps, that maybe are not necessarily into computers and on social media, creating those newsletter opportunities where they can see what's going on, and presentations taking place. Maybe there's a field trip, but then we have the ability to put that on a Zoom call and find different platforms to be able to share these things, as well as those cooperatives working together so that we can be more effective. So those rose to the top in terms of the increase of networking opportunities that we might be able to do regionally and nationally, or even at that local level. So we did create some summary reports, the glossy summary reports for each of those different workshops. And so those are out on our website. But we also did a participants report. So it's a lot more in depth. So people can look at all of those details that happened, and those are actually out on our Partnerscapes Conservation Network, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But we wanted to be sure that we really captured what people came up with. And then each of the participants, we gave them the raw materials. So every single sticky note, flip chart, we put those out there so that people could use it however they would like, as they may want to take that data and distill it in a different way or create something locally or regionally using it as a model. And then we came up with a summary report just recently, so that might even be coming out today and in our newsletter for July. But we took all of this information and distilled it into a summary report so that you guys can kind of look at those results across the whole nation and what kind of popped for us. We have a lot of different ways that we are collaborating. We have some really good ideas. We already had a Facebook page for Partnerscapes, Instagram, X, YouTube site, website. But we also, through this series of workshops, a great idea came out of it to have a Partnerscapes Conservation Network. So we have a Facebook group now, and we encourage all of you to get on there. If you go out to Facebook and just search for Partnerscapes Conservation Network, it'll pop up. And it's a way for everyone in the nation and internationally, if they want it, because we do have some international participation now, but to come on and share those stories of collaborative conservation, working with private landowners, and ask questions of experts, have those great people putting stuff out there. And so everybody not only can see the posts, but they can share their own things. And it's really been a effective way to build our networking and communicate with one another. So we really encourage you to join that and participate with us. We also have an annual event. This year it's going to be in Redmond, Oregon. It's a Private Lands Partners Day. And that's going to be taking place October 7 through 9. And I hope some of you can maybe think about coming out to Oregon and joining us. It's a couple-day event. We do field trips to go out and look at actual projects on the ground working with private landowners. We have a full day in the conference room with presentations and a lot of interaction, and people go home with a ton of new and great ideas. So I hope you can join us for that as well. And so that's it, kind of in a nutshell. And we just wanted to thank you so much for the opportunity to meet with you guys today and share a little bit of what we came up with our forums. We have another one coming up in the Great Plains. That one will be taking place this spring, February 19th through 20. So we're, as we get funding and interest, we're trying to do a few more, but we wanted to take those 3 and really put a bow on it. And then we'll kind of go from there. So I'll turn it back over to you, Katie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather and Steve. It's great to hear kind of the Farm Bill government overview, technical side, and then hear what's going on the ground with landowners and what are those perspectives, which is why I'm so grateful for all of our presenters for being able to join. I think the combination of these areas of expertise is amazing. So we'll open it up for questions. I know we also have a lot of expertise in the room on the Zoom call. So if you are, I know we've got some landowners, I know we have some people who have extensive expertise and experience working with private lands conservation. Feel free to speak up as well and share your reflections and experiences in this field. I'll kick it off with a question. For those of you in the audience, you can raise your hand on Zoom and ask your question. You can also put it in the chat. All of the presenters, I think, mentioned the importance of conservation being local. And I think that's something that we talk about a lot. So Road to Recovery's primary audience are bird species working groups. A lot of the birds are migratory. When we talk about local context with one bird species, we can cover a lot of ground. And so I think a priority of a lot of species working groups is to prioritize geographically where and when we have these priorities on the ground. So I'm wondering if our speakers can speak a little bit about what are the building blocks for engaging on a local level and coming from the perspective of a bird species working group. So these are groups of experts on a particular bird species. So if they're able to get to a point, which we're not all there yet, but some groups are getting to the point of being able to prioritize, this is a key geography. there is a lot of privately owned land in this geography. Do you have tips or advice on how to start that engagement? And we know, Heather, you said it really, really well, that trust is so important. That often means you need a lot of time. But how do you begin that process if you are new to this field?
Well, I could kick that off. I think, you know, a lot of it, you know, when we talk to, you know, new private lines biologists that come in, you know, we talk about finding those magic people, you know, like you come into the community and it's like, you know, where are the places, the gathering places, and who are those landowners that are the early adopters, and, you know, really, kind of bringing sort of the other peoples. You find out who those leaders are, both the private landowners as well as those practitioners on the ground, and you know, kind of do a little bit of shadowing, you know, invite yourself out and kind of watch and learn, but finding out who those experts are and where those gathering places are, and recognize, you know, that, you know, everybody kind of has their expertise. So, you know, it's just like if you're a biologist, bring that to the table and then find out who those people are doing the boots on the ground, and, you know, really try to build those collaborative efforts together, you know.
I'll follow up. I would say, you know, I think as conservation as a community of practice does an excellent job of identifying hotspots of species or habitat types based on biological attributes. But our analysis of where we can actually work today to start building those relationships is somewhat limited. So I would say to non-existent. There are a lot of organizations and agencies that are in this voluntary conservation delivery for different reasons that are all competing for the same base of clients, if you want to look at it like that. A lot of these hotspots for biological diversity are not just a hotspot for your bird species. They're likely they're in many cases they're a hotspot for a lot of different things that people are interested in, and not even just biodiversity, but water quality, carbon sequestration, or other aspects. So I think my recommendation to folks that I've supervised or partnered with is you know, try to do an assessment of the areas that, if you've got a choice of areas to work, where there's some relationships and some trust built already with organizations that share a similar mission with you, or where things might be easier to at least start that conversation and start to build that trust. Don't be afraid to be very partnership oriented, not just before you go out to visit a landowner, to learn about the other players, the other organizations or entities that are active in the area that you're going to focus on. You will get the benefit of their experience and knowledge. Number one, you'll also learn if there are any landmines that you ought not step on as well. Which one thing I've learned about voluntary conservation is you have to carry your baggage and everybody else in the conservation community's baggage in a lot of cases. So it's just good to know when you go into a place where the relationships are good, you can start at this point. Where relationships are non-existent, you're going to have to start at the very beginning of just meeting people and doing a lot of listening and a lot of hanging out, just figuring out what's going on. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit more to that, Katie, and won't belabor the point. But you know, one of the very first places that myself and my team would start would be with a map. We'd start with a map. We'd look at the area that we were interested in, and then we'd, just like Steve said, we would find those other interested parties. Just about everybody has a strategic plan now, and we'd start with state wildlife action strategy, and then we'd move on from there. We'd find out what the Nature Conservancy was interested. We'd find out what Ducks Unlimited was interested. We'd find out what Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever were interested in, and on and on and on. As many of those conservation partners as we had in our local area. And then we would think about the actual area that we wanted to work in, given those partners' efforts in the same locations, and have a few meetings, just have a discussion and say, hey, you know, I've got this bird and I'm concerned about this bird, and I know you're concerned about water quality, and you're concerned about this issue, and you're concerned about that issue. And before long, you've kind of got a story to tell. And then you can actually pull in a few landowners, because working locally, people will know who those landowners are that you can visit with. And many of the Partnerscapes landowners are community leaders. And they have a lot of clout and can actually talk, you know, neighbor to neighbor with other people in the landscape where they live. And once you start getting that kind of activity going, then it's having those conversations at the very beginning levels. And like Steve said, you don't want to hit any landmines. You want to build that conservation partnership up from the ground. And that to me is one of the best ways to be successful. And it's where we got a lot of habitat on the ground here in Missouri.
All very helpful. Thank you. I think too, from a road to recovery perspective, you know, we're an initiative aimed at recovering bird species, but not just any bird species, these tipping point bird species, which are steeply declining. And one of the big challenges is that for many of them, we don't know the biology and the specific threats that we really need to know to be able to prioritize the where and engage in this local conversation. I do think that we have some good guesses for a lot of species, and while the biological efforts continue, that's when this trust building work should start. And I think if we wait until we have all the biology and we have our plan, then we waited a long time. And what we're hearing is that the trust building, the partnership building, getting the network locally to be able to deliver conservation, it takes time. And so I think we need to be doing those things simultaneously. And we don't have to have all the answers from a bird conservation perspective before really investing and engaging in this effort. So you can join the Partnerscapes Conservation Network on Facebook. You know, you don't have to have a goal. You don't have to have an objective other than learning and listening and seeing the examples, and it will spark these ideas as we move forward. I'll continue with another question, but for the group, I have a lot of questions and high interest. Interrupt, please, if you have questions to throw in there. But this one will be a little more directed towards Andrew and Dave. You mentioned, so we have a lot of biologists on the call and in our network for Road to Recovery. And you mentioned influencing at the state level, and specifically with getting involved with state technical committees. Can you speak a little bit about what that looks like? How do you go about engaging? Are those decisions, are they data driven? Are landowners involved in those decisions? Is it, you know, how political is it from an advocacy kind of perspective? Can you speak a little bit to that process?
Dave, do you want to start on that one?
Well, sure. And I guess the quick answer is to all of those that you mentioned is yes. It's all of those things. But and each state technical committee is different. There's different players involved, different folks at the table. But that is one of the best places to have an influence on decisions that are made by NRCS as to how they're going to spend their money and how they're going to be implementing their program. Because this is an advisory committee to the state conservations, who is really the decider on what happens within that state, what happens with the allocations of funds that they've been given to these different programs, and whether and how they're going to focus resources on particular issues. So that is the best place to really have an influence on what happens at the state level. And there are subcommittees of the state technical committee that focus on particular issues, particular wildlife issues, particular issues related to grazing, whatever the key resource issues are for that state. So Andrew, you can jump in, but I think the best way to describe it is you've got a wide variety of participants from pheasants, the NGOs, the state fish and wildlife agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, our partners for Fish and Wildlife Program state coordinators are our representatives on those state technical committees that are bringing the various interests from the Fish and Wildlife Service to the table. You've got ag group representatives, when you've got a wide variety of folks that are all looking to influence those decisions. And the great way to approach it is to bring together a wide variety of folks that are on those technical committees and move a particular issue forward with the support of a lot of the groups that are. Andrew,
Yeah, I mean, so state technical committees, like Dave said, like they look different in every state. Some are way more effective and open and willing and interested in more input than others. And a lot of it just has to do with the dynamics, political, and otherwise the culture in the state, and the state conservationists. But I mean, they are open to the public. They are announced and published online. The minutes are available, so they are very much, even if you're not on the state technical committee, they are very much open to the public to come and listen, find out who's on it, and engage those folks. I might be biased in that I would suggest the first place I'd go if you're interested in a certain state's state tech committee is to the State Fish and Wildlife Agency and finding out their talking with their Farm Bill coordinator or private lands program coordinator. Obviously, of course, you can reach out to Pheasants Forever, or like Dave said, the Partners Fish and Wildlife coordinator in the state, working with some of these partners that are highly and closely engaged with state tech committees is a good first step to finding out how you can get involved, especially with, they have wildlife subcommittees that really determine where those funding pools for wildlife go. Like there's a list of 16 practices nationwide that wildlife practices that count as wildlife practices for that EQIP 10%, but a lot of states have 10 or 15% of their money in their funding pool in the state. They say this is going to wildlife practices, and the wildlife subcommittee decides how that's targeted. You can get way more done there than you can going into the national NRCS office and saying, you need to do more for this in this county. And they're like, don't talk to me. So there's a lot of opportunity there. So I would start with some of those groups and partners to get involved.
And just to add to that, the NRCS state technical committees also advise on implementation of the conservation reserve program. So there's another way that there's an input on how that program is implemented.
Yeah, and I was just gonna add too, I think that's great. I think what works the best, from what I've seen, is when a landowner can really see themselves in it, so how is this practice going to help me with my bottom line? Because ultimately landowners have to be profitable to be able to stay on the land. So while they're really excited about helping wildlife, it actually has to have a benefit to them. So where a strategic plan is written where they can see themselves in that, like, oh, you're going to help me reduce my endangered or my invasive species. Great. You're going to help me have better grass and better water for my cattle. Or, you know, okay, I'm going to put this crop on the ground and you want this water in the spring for your birds. How are you going to incentivize that for me? So, you know, well, what if I had some flooded water on this for the beginning, and you paid me more than I could make if I had that crop? But so, you know, finding those ways in the strategic plans, and the way we're building these things out, whether it's at the local focus area, the statewide level, or the regional level, having landowners be able to see themselves in that. You know, I'm building a wetland for a shorebird. Well, I need a stock pond. Okay, we're going to build you a stock pond. You know, sometimes it's the way it's phrased. So the birds are landing there, and great, the cattle are getting water and the birds are having a great time. And, you know, so where we can word things and write a strategic plan where they can see themselves in that. And so that's where these collaboratives work so good, you know, where the scientists are coming in and saying, this is exactly what we need. The water needs to be this high and this deep, da, 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 da. The grass needs to be this high and this that. Great. Okay, now tell me how on this person's ranch or farm, they can take that practice and help them increase their bottom line. So sometimes it is that communication to have that understanding from the biologists and the agriculturists and the landowners, and they're all sitting at the table, and you get a few of those landowners that are willing to sit and talk to you, and you can say just about anything, and they're not like, I'm really offended by that. Okay, I won't say that, you know, but teach me, you know? So I think that's one of the things we've learned with some of our strategic plans. Don't build it all scientific and have it sit on a shelf. Have it be where it can open up at the kitchen table and people, the actual people, your audience, can see themselves, you know?
Yes, exactly. And Heather, you couldn't have done a better job tying this up in true Road to Recovery fashion, because what is the basis of what we're trying to do as an initiative is advocate for co-production of science. And one person does not have to do it all. One team doesn't have to solve the problem, but we have to work together to co-produce solutions that are mutually beneficial across the landscape. So well done. You did my job for me, and I appreciate that. We are right at time, so we will wrap now. A million thanks to our presenters, to Kelly for co-planning this session with me. Thank you all for your time and sharing your expertise. To our audience, please reach out to me if you have follow-up questions. I'm happy to connect you with any of the presenters, and I'll also follow up, as I said, with some resources, follow-up material. We intend, and our goal is for this to lead off a series of private lands focused engagement sessions. So we hope to see you back for those in the future. Thank you all so much.